JB, and thank you very much for the invitation. I really appreciate it. I've been here a number of times, and it's lovely to see you guys. So I'll be brief and just set out a few things today on this the occasion of Dr. Ambedkar's birthday, and speak about three different aspects of this sort of larger question that Karthik and I have discussed. I should address, and I want to talk about first a little bit about Hindutva or Hindu nationalism and caste in its origin in India. Then I want to talk about how and why Dr. Ambedkar today is being claimed by the Hindu nationalist movement in various ways, and is something I'm sure you come across. And then finally come to the longer part, which is how I see and why caste is being reinvented the way it is in the US today, and other parts of the world for that matter. But let's focus on America today. Now, so just to begin with beginnings, as I'm sure many of you will know, that the core organization of contemporary Hindu nationalism, the RSS, was founded in 1925 by a bunch of Brahmin men in the city of Nagpur in contemporary Maharashtra. The idea of this organization was to create a self-defense organization that would train upper caste men and give them physical strength, but also mental strength to, in their own words, to undo the harm of centuries of Muslim rule and to instill a sense of strength and unity among them, but also a kind of moral upliftment. So the idea was that Hindus, especially upper caste Hindu men, had been humiliated by being under the rule of Muslim rulers for so long, and it's of course very noteworthy that the uniforms that the RSS chose for itself was actually a complete copy of the colonial police uniform, right? And that is not an accident, because there were many of these early founders who were quite, as you will know, that they did not participate in the freedom struggle. They were actually quite admiring of the British, and many aspects of British manliness, especially this idea that the Brits were more masculine and more forthright and more aggressive, and they wanted Hindus to learn from that, especially upper caste Hindus. Now, it's only really later on in the 1940s, and especially from the 1960s onwards, that there is a concerted effort to go out and recruit people from other caste groups than the upper caste. So in the beginning, many decades, it was mainly Brahmins and Vanyas who made up the ranks of the RSS. It also meant that RSS was a small organization, and there were clear limits to its growth for multiple reasons I'm happy to talk about. The big breakthrough comes, and I'm sure you're familiar with this, comes in the 1980s around the campaign around the so-called liberation of Ram's birthplace, the Ram Janmabhoomi movement in North India, where there was a founding of organizations such as Bajrang Dal and Durga Vahini for women that explicitly set out to recruit members from Bahujan communities and from Dalit communities as well. And this is also where there is a sort of beginning of an outreach to both Bahujan and Dalit and STs, tribal communities in the field of electoral politics. And it has started to bear some fruit. In fact, it's a well-known, I'm sure many of you will be, although many of you are from the South, but one of the famous examples was, of course, how BJP successfully turned many of the Dalit communities that were not Chamaras against the Bahujan Samaj Party in Uttar Pradesh, and these are large numbers, large communities, and said, look, Madam, that is Mayawati had not been looking after your interests, so now you come to us. And they did. And it's a fact that the contemporary support for the BJP across the country also comes in part, in various parts of the country, from Dalit communities. And I'm happy to discuss more why that is. One of the reasons for it, obviously, is a frustration with the ineffectiveness of Dalit representation in various parties, and the fact that the BJP offers a form of, you know, join the big community, join uplift, join a sort of a path towards self-respect and towards respectability. That's at least what the promise is. However, there's no evidence so far, those who follow Indian politics will know this, there's no evidence so far of any member belonging to a, for instance, an SC community that has risen to prominence in the BJP. There's some who are prominent in members of parliament and so on and so forth, but if you go and look at other parts of the Hindu nationalist movement, there is no members from the Bahujan communities or from the scheduled caste that actually have risen to high position. So a lot of it is a form of paternalistic talk, you might say, and it reflects how many RSS men themselves will talk about caste. They will say, well, it's an ill that divides Hindu society, so we have to get over it. It's a mindset that we have to get over, and actually it's better not to talk about it. If we don't mention it and don't talk about it, we just address everybody as Hindus, it might go away. And it's all in the name of dividing, or that caste itself is a divisive topic. And we know this is a conversation that comes up, it's come up in this, as Lakshmi was just mentioning, in this recent debate about making caste a protected category, right? So it's always about caste as a divisive topic that should be kept mum. So this attitude is very widespread. It also includes, I would say, that some of you may know that someone like Savarkar, who was a sort of the intellectual father of the term Hindutva in the 1920s, also launched a critique of caste. And it was of the same kind. He was vehemently opposed to caste, but he was opposed to the caste thinking in the upper caste, and he said, look, we are dividing and weakening ourselves in the face of our true enemy, the Muslims. So we have to uplift people. He founded an organization called Patit Pavan, which basically means uplift of the broken, or the sinners, right? So it's a very paternalistic, typical kind of Brahminical gesture, to still within this idea that the problem is ours. We have a wrong mindset, so we have to help these people who it behooves us to help, but nothing more than that. No larger idea of what's actually going on, as that caste is a systemic problem, and caste is a way of organizing an entire society. Let me just tell you a little story before I move on to the next thing. That I was, 5 years ago, I was a visiting professor at IIT Bombay for a year on and off. I came and I taught every now and then. I was invited to give something called the Institute Lecture, which happens a couple of times a year, where everybody, all the faculty and students come together. It's a big affair. I decided to talk about how caste structures the Indian economy and opportunities for people in the labor market and also in businesses. And many people didn't like my talk, as you can imagine. And let me just give you some highlights from some of the comments. Here was one who said, well, listen, Professor, all societies are unequal. You have racism in the US. Why do you need to come to India to talk about these things? Such talk will not benefit India's development, and it will hurt the poorest the most. Right? So it's all my fault, right? By talking about it, right? And another memorable comment was, so maybe hierarchies are just natural. There is natural variation in everything in nature and among humans. Don't you agree? Wouldn't that also be the case with intellectual aptitude? And I said, absolutely, but not along pre-given lines, like in India, right? Or in the US, where there was an idea of race being a pre-given form of distribution of these things. So, and so on and so forth. So when I say that, you can say that the attitudes to caste you find in the Hindu nationalist movement are actually not that unusual. They actually represent what a lot of people, also those who would never vote for the BJP, would think, right? And I mean, I don't need to say this to you, you know this, but it's worth thinking about that it's actually not in some ways worse. It represents a very mainstream, it's impolite to talk about, and so on and so forth in India. And that's kind of what, there was a Dalit scholar called Suryakant Bhakmara, some of you may be familiar with him. He's actually a a colleague works at IIT Bombay. He has written some great stuff about what he calls Hindu politeness, which is exactly the way of not talking about caste and thereby letting caste be, right? All right, so second short theme is what's going on with this appropriation of Ambedkar by the BJP and the RSS. Now, it manifests in multiple ways. As you know, there are major statues being sponsored, festivals. Ambedkar is being promoted across India also by the Hindutva forces as a great Indian patriot, as the author of the Constitution. They've finally come around to say that, although, as you know, the BJP is not, many BJP members are not great fans of the Constitution or any of the ideals outlined in it, but be that as it may for now. Where did they get this idea of Ambedkar being a great nationalist who is in fact aligned with their point of view? They go two places. First, they go to Ambedkar's book that's called Pakistan, or The Partition of India, that some of you may be familiar with. He wrote, it was published in 1945. Now that book is interesting, and I won't talk too much about it, but if any of you are interested in this question, he's very strongly critical of the Muslim League, the political party that had been in existence for many decades at that point, and had at that time adopted the slogan of wanting to have a separate state for Muslims. And he's critical of it for two reasons. One is that he says it's led by elite Muslims who are actually not in any way interested in representing the great mass of Muslims, and they are not interested in having a conversation about caste stratification and caste oppression within the larger Muslim community. So this idea of Muslim elite politics actually putting a lid on all these things in the name of protecting minority interest. The second, he says, is that why is it that a party that was set up to protect minority interests is now turning out to wanting to have a majoritarian state of its own, right? And in some ways, what you see in Pakistan following that is you can say that many of Ambedkar's predictions have turned out to be true, that a majoritarian state will always veer towards something that's undemocratic and oppressive, and that is indeed what has happened. The third thing he's saying is, in this book, is that if there is a Pakistan, a Muslim Raj, there's also have to be a Hindu Raj, right? There has to be a Hindu majoritarian state. In fact, it justifies the idea of India being a Hindu state, a predominantly Hindu society, and a Hindu majority. And therein lies a great danger, he says, and you won't be surprised to hear this, because everything about Hindu society is diametrically opposed to any principle of democracy, equality, justice, and liberty, and fraternity. So there was no way you could found a state of that. So the idea that Ambedkar is anti-Muslim and therefore aligned with the BJP is based on, let's say, either non-reading or willfully bad reading of this book. And mostly, I think, number two, yeah. The second place they go is to say, look, Ambedkar was a great patriot because when he wanted to opt out of Hinduism, he was kind enough to choose an Indic religion, that is Buddhism, and not one of those awful imported faiths like Islam or Christianity. And that shows that he's loyal to the motherland, he's loyal to the civilization that is India, and so on and so forth. And again, if you read any of Ambedkar's writings on Buddhism, it's very hard to find any of that sort of civilizational logic. In fact, what Ambedkar, those of you who are familiar with those texts, the Buddha and his Dhamma, for instance, will know that what he is looking, that Ambedkar was first and foremost a believer in universal values, in universal human worth. And he saw that as a crucial value in politics. He was in favor of republics. He was against any kind of inherited privilege. He was in favor of universal equality and freedom. And he was also in the sphere of ethics and religion, of course, in favor of those forms of belief that were most conducive to this kind of universalist ideal. And in his view, it was Buddhism that had that potential more than any other religion. So again, the contemporary attempt to appropriate Ambedkar is pretty misguided. Let me say a little more here towards the third point, which is why is it that caste has traveled so well? Well, it travels well, as we know, not just to the US, but it has traveled across everywhere where people from India have gone. And caste doesn't need Brahmins to exist. There's a famous joke people tell in South Africa, which is to say that most of the people who came as indentured laborers went to Fiji, Suriname, Guyana, South Africa, and many other places. South Africa is used to be the biggest community of people of Indian origin outside of India until about 30 years ago, when the population in the US overtook them. But there was a famous joke saying that in India they have Brahmins by birth. Here we have Brahmins by boat. And by that they mean that people on the boat to South Africa began to sort of claim and invent stories about themselves, and people who belonged to the Maharaj community from the Bhojpur region, who are traditionally cooks for Brahmin landlords, began to assume the status of kind of stand-in Brahmins in South Africa, and so on and so forth. So there are lots of, and people are very well aware of this. So you don't need Brahmins in order to have caste. Caste is a way of thinking about other people, a way of categorizing your people from your own community as better as anyone else, and always thinking in hierarchical terms. Now, in the US, as we know, the US is, the Indian population in the US is unique. If you look at the larger population of people from Indian origin, in that it is has an unusual predominance of people from both Brahmins but also from other upper castes. That has a lot to do, of course, with as we all know, the immigration policies and the fact that the H-1B has been one of the main ways in which to arrive here, and I need not instruct any of you in that. I'm myself also a beneficiary of the H-1B system. But what happened is, of course, that this predominantly upper caste demographic has arrived in the US and has experienced the world in quite different ways from what it was at home. And I think one of the most important things to think about is the kind of, what you can say, the naturalness of how caste is experienced in India, the way in which many people believe that this is the natural order of things. And it's easy to map and read other people you meet, either in your educational institution, your workplace, or in your street, or on the market, or whatever. People grow. We know this is how social life is organized to a large extent in India, also in workplaces, that people have a pretty precise reading of who belongs where, right? And communities and categories of people come in as known quantities. What happens in the US is, of course, and you're all familiar with this, and I'd love to have more of a conversation with you about this in your own experience. In the US, and maybe California more than any other place in the US that I know, it's really culture that ideas of a kind of cultural distinction, or you have culture in various ways in your cultural background, that is the kind of sort of the way in which people approach those they do not know. And there's an interesting distinction here, I think, that as you know, or maybe you haven't encountered this, but I encounter it all the time. White people in the US all have ethnicity. The people will tell you, I'm a quarter Irish, a quarter German, and 2 quarters something else, right? And the specificity of these sort of accounts are very interesting. But if you are a person of color, and I say this because I'm myself married to a proud Tamil woman, if you're a person of color, you have race, right? And that's a different thing. So within a racial category, there's all kinds of other assumptions operating, such as pretty sort of internally homogeneous assumptions about that if you are of a certain kind, if you are from Mexico, or you are from China, or you are from the Philippines, you belong, it's sort of one cultural pot, as it were. There's very little sense of differentiation internal to those categories. You all encounter this. Now, and of course that's very infuriating for most people who come here to be able to, and this is vis-a-vis the sort of, not just white Americans, but I think this is kind of part of the code in which with which people interact with each other. And this, of course, has allowed people from the privileged caste in India to arrive here and reinvent themselves, not just as Brahmins or Banyas or other things, but as Indians, right? And that's important. And it's banal, but it's very important, because it means, what is it you stand in for? You stand in for an entire country, an entire civilization, an entire tradition, and this is a role that many Brahmins they're only too happy to accept that role. And so, in that sense, you can say that the Indian American community is closer to what Ambedkar would have called a Hindu Raj than anything back in India, right? What does that mean? It means that, for instance, that there is limited work on this, but there is some work that suggests, for instance, that there are actually more intercaste marriages in the US today than it would be the norm back in India. But these are not marriages that cross religious or caste lines for real. They are between upper caste communities, in many ways mirroring exactly what's happening also in certain middle class environments in India, where it's common to have marriages between different people within the twice-born categories, but it's increasingly rare to have marriages that actually, as it were, cross that bar that go to either Bahujan or Dalit communities. There's also representation with representing yourself as naturally Indian or an inheritor of everything Indian. There's also another thing that's been historically important, and I remember last year, I think Balmuli and Natarajan talked about this as well, the importance of not being black, right? Because in many parts of the country, initially when people were less familiar with people from South Asia, there was a categorization of many folks from the subcontinent as being in the same category as black people. And that is something that most of the people from the upper caste communities in this country have fought very hard to avoid. And we know that, and it's a statistic that's being touted many times, that Indian Americans are some of the most upwardly mobile and most actually successful in American life of all the visible minorities in this country. And a lot of that has to do with this quest for recognition, this drive to also show that one is different and one doesn't belong to those other categories that one is trying to not be associated with. So that brings me to one thing that, and I want to end on this, to say that, so the odd thing here is that you have in some ways we often say about Hindu nationalism or Hindu nationalist support in India that in India you can say Hindu nationalists represent Hindus as a majority with a minority complex, with a feeling of being historically persecuted and having to protect oneself and so on and so forth. Whereas in the US, you can say that many upper caste Indians feel that they are minority, but maybe they have some sort of majority complex, wanting in some ways to stand in for the majority back home, stand in for Indian culture as a whole, and also wanting to be accepted into white society in the US. And I want to end on one example that some of you may be familiar with, but you know there is a process around the California history textbooks and the history of that is interesting in that it begins in the 1970s where good liberal people of the state decided that there should be an opportunity for communities of color at this, and different ethnicities, began with mainly Latinos, but also the Chicano movement and also Native Americans and increasingly also Filipinos, to be able to have a say in and comment on the way in which the history of their home countries or their culture was represented in the history textbooks that's kind of a matrix for many other history books that are used in American schools because of the size of the state. So there's been these battles back and forth, and some of you, I'm sure you're familiar with this. One of the big battles about 10 years ago was about, a little less than that, was about caste, right? And there, I was involved, along with other people who were representing centers for South Asia at major universities in the state, as kind of expert witnesses. We weighed in on the different comments that had come both from Dalit organizations, but also from Sikhs, or the Sikh organizations, and other people had made representations to this commission that scrutinized the history books. And what's interesting was that the argument against caste being included was not that it was historically inaccurate. It was actually that it would be damaging to the psychological well-being of Indian American kids in this country to be exposed to this history of India, right? And what they did at the hearings was that they had mobilized, Hindu American Foundation had mobilized a whole bunch of high school kids who were very articulate, very well spoken, showed up. Some of them were also crying. Some of you will remember this, right? But if we think of what is, they were saying that the reason why we shouldn't, you shouldn't teach American kids about caste is it'll inflict hurt on us, right? So it's in some ways a profoundly sort of narcissistic gesture that says something about how caste is seen, not as a systemic injury and systemic inequality that causes hurt to millions and hundreds of millions of people, has done that historically, but as something that should be, as it were, not spoken about, right? So it's an extension of this kind of what Wagner calls the Hindu politeness, right? That we should just not talk about it because it will jeopardize our well-being as a successful minority in the US, and we have the right to also have our culture protected. I found that interesting. Unfortunately, but maybe predictably, some of those sentiments actually swayed some of the opinion among some of the people and said, well, maybe we should also be a little sensitive to how it's, that it doesn't create a rift. And there you run up against this thing, and I'll end with this, that this idea of cultural unity that's so hard to break down. I'm constantly in conversation with colleagues and others about how desperately poor the coverage and understanding of South Asian dynamics are in the wider public sphere of the US, how little coverage there is, and how much good press India gets from all the years of being hailed as the greatest democracy in the world and so on, and the long after effects of that, and how difficult it is to make people understand that India doesn't have one culture, it has many, and it doesn't have one people, it has many, it doesn't have one tradition, it has many, and so on and so forth, it doesn't have one religion, it has many. And that is I think is maybe the biggest challenge that's facing anyone who is doing this kind of work and who's both intellectually as well as activists, is to, in a sense, break down that. And what we're up against is this kind of very everyday understanding among majority of Americans that people who come from somewhere else they have a culture and that we should try to respect it. And this is a sentiment that's also very prevalent among the most progressive and those who are the best allies in some ways. But this inability to see behind that figure of a unified culture that somehow has a center and has and is worthy of respect, right? So I want to end with that, but I think in terms of what caste is, the caste has become in many ways a battle over representation of culture, right? And there's a necessity to break it down, as it were, to break down the notion of something called Indian culture, which I personally never believed existed. Thank you very much.